Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. A Connoisseur of Happiness. January 5, 2010. A couple of years back, I got a phone call from a friend who had attended a Dhamma talk, where the teacher had said that life is suffering is the second noble truth. The friend called up to scoff at the teacher, saying that, of course, everyone knows that that's not the second noble truth, that's the first noble truth. And I had to tell him that it wasn't any noble truth. The Buddha never said that life is suffering. He said there is suffering in life. That was his first noble truth. And he identified what that suffering is, but he went on to say that there is a cause for suffering that you can abandon, and there is a path to the end of suffering that you can develop, so that you can reach the end of suffering, all of which can be found in life. So life isn't just suffering. It's important to underline that point, because so many people misunderstand the Buddha's attitude toward happiness and suffering. Just this last weekend, I heard someone saying that the Buddha's basic teachings are that all things are inconstant and all things are suffering. That's not the case, either. As the Buddha once said, if there were no pleasure in the five aggregates, we wouldn't be attached to them. They do offer pleasure. And we need to understand the different kinds of pleasure they offer, so we can use that pleasure as a means to the highest happiness or the highest pleasure. Nibbana. The Pali word for pleasure and happiness is sukha. It's one of the Buddha's most basic terms, and as is so often the case with the most central terms in the Buddha's teachings, he doesn't define it. Sukha can be translated as bliss, pleasure, ease, well-being, or happiness. What the Buddha does describe in detail are the different levels of sukha and the different ways that sukha functions. In other words, he describes what's practical to know about sukha, so that you can know which kinds of sukha to pursue and which to avoid. I think one of the reasons he doesn't define sukha is because, as you practice, your sense of what counts as happiness is going to develop and get more refined. So it's important that your idea of happiness doesn't get nailed down too tightly when you're starting out. The Buddha's own search was a search for true happiness, a happiness that doesn't age, grow ill, or die. That's what he was looking for. After having spent years indulging in the intense sensual pleasures of the palace, he did what so many people do when they have been indulging in sensual pleasure that way. He went to the other extreme and practiced austerities. In his case, for 6 years. He denied himself food, forced himself not to breathe, and grew very emaciated because he was afraid of pleasure. One of the most important insights of that period, though, was that denying yourself any kind of pleasure at all is not the way. It doesn't lead to liberation. So then the question arose in his mind, is there another way? And he thought of the time when he was a child, sitting under a tree, and had entered the first jhana. Rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Recollecting that, he had an instinctive sense that that would be the path, but then he asked himself, why am I afraid of that pleasure? And he realized it was nothing to be afraid of. It wasn't intoxicating, it didn't cause any harm to anyone. Those are the two defining aspects of any pleasure that's unskillful. It's harmful and it's intoxicating. We see so many pleasures in life that involve oppressing other people. The people enjoying those pleasures may not be conscious of the fact that they're causing oppression or hardship. To whatever extent they do notice, they'll often close their minds to it and deny that it's causing anybody any harm, or if it is causing somebody harm, it's causing harm to people or beings who don't matter. That attitude is one of the things that makes that pleasure unskillful. Not only does it harm other people, but it also fosters unskillful qualities of indifference and lack of shame. Intoxicating pleasure is the kind that dulls the mind, so you can't really see what you're doing. The most obvious examples of this sort of pleasure are those that come from alcohol and drugs, but there are other intoxicating pleasures as well. Anything that excites a very strong addiction, that dulls the mind, dulls your perceptions. That's a kind of pleasure to be avoided. The pleasure of jhana, though, is neither harmful nor intoxicating. Sometimes modern Dhamma teachers will warn you about the dangers of getting attached to the pleasures of jhana, that somehow they're a major peril to be avoided and feared, but the Buddha never talked in those terms. Quite the contrary. He said that if you don't have the pleasure of jhana or something better than that, you won't be able to let go of your attachments to sensual pleasures. To let go of a lower level pleasure, you need something higher to hold on to, something to substitute for it. Otherwise, you go sneaking back to your old ways, denying the fact that you're doing that. Or you grow attached to your pride that you're so strong, so resilient, and so tough in the practice that you don't need pleasure, but then that pride becomes a major obstacle to seeing where the mind is actually looking to feed. As the Buddha said, the pleasure of jhana is a necessary part of the practice. It's the kind of happiness that allows you to have a sense of well-being, a sense of nourishment along the way, and yet keeps the mind clear, so that it sees what it's doing. The Buddha actually talks of jhana in terms of food. He says we feed on rapture when we meditate. And he describes jhana as a storehouse of provisions. He compares the practice as a whole to building and maintaining a fortress on a frontier. Mindfulness is the gatekeeper who knows whom to let in and whom to keep out. Discernment is the well-plastered wall that the enemy can't climb because they can't gain a foothold on the plaster. Persistence is your army of soldiers. And jhana is your storehouse of grain, honey, oil. All the food you need in order to keep the gatekeeper and the army strong. So the pleasure of jhana is a necessary part of the practice. It keeps you nourished. As for the danger of getting attached to that nourishment, I can find only one passage in the canon where the Buddha talks about the danger of jhana, and it's relatively minor. He says that once you can attain jhana and you decide you don't want to go any further, it's like holding a stick covered with sap, and your hand gets stuck to the stick because of the sap. But jhana doesn't make it impossible to get unstuck. In fact, you need the stillness of jhana to look objectively at the pleasures you've been attached to so far in your life, to see that they're no match for the pleasures of concentration. Only then are you encouraged to ask yourself, are there any drawbacks to this state of concentration? Is there something better than this? That reflection becomes a solvent that removes the sap from your hands. In any event, I don't know anyone who's killed anyone, stolen anything, or broken any of the other precepts through attachment to jhana. But you look at the way people are attached to sensual pleasures. It's the source for a lot of the cruelty, heartlessness, and thoughtlessness in the world, all the harm that people cause one another. If you're not attached to the pleasure of jhana, if you don't have that available, you're going to sneak back to the types of pleasure that can cause all kinds of harm to yourself and to others. So don't be afraid of the pleasure of jhana. Don't try to avoid it for fear that you'll get stuck. Of course you're going to get stuck, at least for a while, but you're stuck on the kind of pleasure that allows you to clarify the mind. That way you can begin to see what's going on, where you're stuck, and how to get unstuck. This is an important part of noble right concentration. Not simply that you get into the different levels of jhana, but that the mind can then step back while you're in the jhana to examine the state of jhana, while you're still within its range. The Buddha gives the analogy of a person sitting who's watching someone who's lying down, or a person standing who's watching someone sitting. In other words, you're above and behind your own state of concentration, and you can see what's going on. Or you could compare it to having your hand in a glove. When you're fully in the glove of jhana, you can't observe it. But when you pull the glove off a bit, without totally removing it from your hand, you can look around at the mind inside the glove. That way you thoroughly comprehend how the mind relates to its object, which gives you insight into the process of fabrication. This is where fabrication becomes clearest. When you're in a state of strong concentration and you can see the movements of the mind very clearly. Ultimately, you reach the point where you decide that even the pleasure of jhana is not pleasant enough, it's not peaceful enough, because of the instabilities of fabrication. You want something more peaceful, something more solid than fabrication can make. So it's not that you stop aiming at happiness and pleasure. It's just that your idea of happiness and pleasure gets more refined. This is when you can let go of the jhana and, through insight into the process of fabrication, allow the fabrication to stop. You no longer try to fabricate anything out of what you've got in the present moment. That's when the mind opens up in an unexpected way to something that's not fabricated. And the realization hits that when the Buddha said there is a deathless happiness, he knew what he was talking about. You've got your evidence right here. You see very clearly the stress that's involved even in the fabrication of a very subtle pleasure of concentration, because you've got something better, the unfabricated, to compare it to. So the Buddha is not teaching you to be a stoic with a stiff upper lip, denying yourself any pleasure or happiness. He himself was actually a connoisseur of pleasure. He wanted only the highest happiness. And he found it. As for us, he wants us to want only the highest happiness, and to practice so we can find it. 2. He didn't say that pleasure is bad, or that nullness is good, but he did say that different levels of pleasure have different effects on the mind. You want to look at the pleasure you find in different aspects of your life to see which kinds of pleasure are harmful and intoxicating, and which ones help to clear the mind. The ones that clear the mind include not only the pleasure of concentration, but also the pleasure of generosity and the pleasure of observing the precepts. The Buddha talks about how the practice of generosity and the precepts gives rise to a sense of joy, a sense of well-being, that then becomes a basis for concentration. From there, you develop the more refined levels of pleasure that come with concentration. As the mind grows clearer and clearer, you get to the ultimate pleasure, one totally free from disturbance, because it lies outside of space and time. Years back, I attended a commemoration for Ajahn Lee's passing. It was the last commemoration I attended before I returned to the States. They had invited a senior monk from Bangkok to give the concluding Dhamma talk of the commemoration, but about 15 minutes before he was scheduled to get up on the Dhamma seat, he still hadn't arrived. They got a phone call from him that he was stuck in traffic and wouldn't be able to make it in time. So they asked one of the forest ajahns to get up and give a talk instead. His talk was about how the central teaching of the Buddha was about suffering and stress. He talked for an hour about the Four Noble Truths, with his major focus on the truth of suffering, suffering, suffering. Just a few minutes after he had finished, the senior monk from Bangkok finally arrived. So they asked him to get up on the sermon seat and give a talk, too. He hadn't heard what the previous talk was. He got up and he said the Buddha's central teaching was all about happiness. And both were right. The Buddha talked about suffering because he wanted us to see the suffering we tend not to see, so we can look for a higher happiness, and not just for the kind of happiness with which we tend to content ourselves. So when the Buddha talked about dukkha, suffering or stress, he wasn't just saying that life is miserable, and all you can do is accept the fact. He was saying that there is suffering, but it doesn't have to be there. There's the suffering of the three characteristics, which is inherent in fabricated things. But on top of that is the suffering in the Four Noble Truths, which is caused by craving and clinging. That kind of suffering you can put an end to. And when you put an end to it, the suffering of the three characteristics no longer weighs on the mind, because you've found something that lies beyond what's fabricated. So the Buddha talked about suffering for the sake of happiness, for the sake of true happiness. He was like a doctor. When you go to see the doctor and he asks you, "Okay, what's wrong? Where does it hurt?" He's not being pessimistic. He focuses on your illness because he has a cure. The Buddha described himself as a doctor. He focused on stress and suffering because he had a cure, leading to the health of true happiness. Always keep this point in mind as you practice. We're not here to run away from pleasure. We're here to see what pleasure really is and become connoisseurs of pleasure, distinguishing between which kind of pleasure, when you indulge in it, has harmful results, and which kind of pleasure, when you indulge in it, becomes part of the path so that you can find the ultimate pleasure that doesn't require indulgence at all. It's just there. That's what we're practicing for. Virtue contains the practice. August 18, 2011. There's a passage in the canon where a group of monks are going off to a foreign land, and so they go to pay their respects to the Buddha. He asks them, "Have you gone to see Sariputta?" They say, no, they haven't, so he recommends that they do. When they pay their respects to Sariputta, he asks them, "Suppose you meet intelligent people in that foreign land who ask you what your teacher teaches. What are you going to tell them?" So the monks ask him what he would recommend that they say. The first thing he starts out with is, "Our teacher teaches the subduing of passion and delight." Most of us, if we heard that as the first thing the Buddha taught, would probably run away. We like our passion, we like our delight. But notice that Sariputta starts off with an action. The Buddha teaches you something to do. As Sariputta explains it, if the person asks, "Passion and delight for what?" you say, "For the 5 aggregates." What's the danger of having that passion and delight for those things? It's that you suffer as they change. And the advantage of abandoning that passion and delight is that you put an end to that suffering. So it's all about doing. The Buddha's own first teaching on the Noble Eightfold Path was also a recommendation on what to do. This means that the teaching starts out with action as its basic principle. Actions are real. You choose your actions, you can change them. Those actions have life-shaping consequences, so you need to pay attention to what you're doing and to the consequences you're creating. This leads to a series of shoulds and should nots. Actions you should do and actions you shouldn't if you want to put an end to suffering. The if there is crucial. The Buddha's shoulds are conditional in the sense that if you want to put an end to suffering, this is what you have to do. He's not forcing anything on you, but he is giving you guidance, and his guidance is categorical, i.e., true across the board. As he said, our normal reaction to suffering is bewilderment and a search. The bewilderment is that we don't know why we're suffering. Why is this happening? What can we do? If you don't believe in the principle of human action, you stay bewildered. There were people who, in the Buddha's time, taught that human action is powerless. The Buddha rarely went out of his way to seek out other people to argue with them, but he did go to argue with those who taught doctrines that basically left you without any hope for making a difference in the present moment either, by teaching that everything is the result of past action, or everything is a result of the will of a creator, or that everything is totally without cause. Those kinds of teaching, he said, leave you bewildered because they leave no grounds for a should or should not. If everything is determined, there's nothing you can do. If there's no connection between cause and effect, then no matter what you do, you can't have an impact on anything. You're lost. You have no recourse when suffering comes up. So the Buddha's teaching you what to do when you suffer so that you're no longer bewildered and you don't have to continue suffering. And in that way, his teaching is a gift. As with any gift, when you receive it, you want to make good use of it. You don't want to just throw it away. You learn to be grateful for the generosity of the person who gave it and try to put it to the best use possible. So what is the best use possible? You start by looking at your own actions because that's where the teaching is aimed. You look at the results of the actions you're doing right now to see if there's any connection between what you're doing and the fact that there's suffering in the mind. This is why the Buddha says that uncertainty is overcome by looking at skillful and unskillful qualities in the mind. To begin with, you're focusing your attention on the most important issue in life, which is what sort of impact your actions are having, and particularly what kind of impact your mind states are having. After all, the source of action is in the mind. If you're uncertain about different mental qualities, then watch. Try developing goodwill, try being generous, try observing the precepts. See what kind of impact these qualities have on your life. At the same time, try to develop the qualities that allow you to judge these things in fairness and with accuracy. Try to be mindful, try to be alert. Mindfulness is what connects cause and effect. If you don't have any mindfulness, i.e., if you can't remember what you did, you're not going to be able to figure out how this feeling of pain or this feeling of pleasure is related to actions you did a while back and have forgotten about. So you try to keep in mind what you've been doing. If you see any suffering coming up in your experience, try to trace it back. What action is this related to? What kind of attitude is this related to? The fact that there's pain in the body is a normal part of life, but the fact that there's a pain in the mind is unnecessary. It doesn't have to be there. So what's causing the pain in the mind? If you can trace it back to an action, physical, verbal, or mental, then you've got a handle on things. You can end your uncertainty, you can end your bewilderment. Of course, this requires alertness as well. That you really are paying attention to what you're doing. All too many of us don't. We go through life just going through the motions without looking carefully at our intentions. If you ask most people why they did something, they have to cast back, and often they can't think of why, so they invent a why. But if your alertness was shaky to begin with, that why is really unreliable. So you really want to be alert to what you're doing, i.e., to what you're intending right now. The more alert you are to your actions, the more you'll be able to remember what you've done. This is why mindfulness and alertness go together. Then you combine these two qualities with the Buddha's shoals and shoals. That's what ardency is all about. When the Buddha gave a categorical teaching about skillful and unskillful actions, he didn't just say that the distinction between the two is a categorical truth. The categorical truth is that unskillful things should be abandoned, and skillful things should be developed. Again, there's a should there. There's a recommended course of action. As you actually pursue that course of action with a sense of interest, of a desire to know, that's ardency. You're bringing all three of these qualities together: mindfulness, alertness, and ardency. In the beginning, you develop these qualities as you follow the precepts. This is one of the reasons why the precepts come so early in many of the Buddha's teachings. In the Noble Eightfold Path, for example, he talks about right speech, right action, and right livelihood before he talks about meditation. In his graduated discourse, virtue follows right after generosity. The reason for this is that when you're trying to develop virtue, you have to look at the things you're doing in your day-to-day life. This is how you develop your mindfulness and alertness. If you see that you're causing any harm, you try to drop what you're doing so as to stop that harm. That's how you develop ardency. Fortunately, the Buddha doesn't force you to experiment with every possible course of action to see whether or not it's harmless. He gives you guidance. He says across the board that you don't want to kill, you don't want to steal, you don't want to have illicit sex, you don't want to lie, and you don't want to take intoxicants. That last one is important because, as he said, we're already intoxicated with youth, we're intoxicated with health, we're intoxicated with beauty, we're intoxicated with life. The mind is already drunk. You don't want to add any more intoxication on top of that, because you won't be able to develop the mindfulness and alertness you need in order to see things clearly and judge your actions fairly. So you try to hold to these precepts and see what impact they have on your life. That's the only way you're going to come to any kind of certainty. And it's the only way you're going to lead a life that provides a good container for the practice. You see this so many times on retreats when people come in off the street to spend a whole week just being with their breath. If they have any unskillful behavior in their past, it's going to come up at some point or another in the retreat. I myself haven't been to many meditation retreats, but I do remember one in particular where, halfway through the retreat, one guy just broke down and started sobbing deeply in the middle of the afternoon. It went on for about 10-15 minutes. I found it very disturbing. But everybody else in the room was sitting there quietly as if nothing were happening. I learned later that this is a normal occurrence on retreats. It turned out this particular person had been a cocaine dealer And some of the stuff that he'd been engaged in while selling cocaine was coming up in his awareness. I was also told that this happens on modern meditation retreats all the time. People come in with no background in virtue, and the stillness of the retreat provides a space for their remorse to suddenly erupt. This may provide a moment of catharsis, but not much more. If you have big wounds in your life caused by your misbehavior, it's very difficult for the mind to settle down and really be mindful and alert with enough stability to see things as they're actually happening and to direct your attention in a wise direction. So the principle of virtue is very important, both as a container for the practice and as basic training in mindfulness, alertness, and ardency. These are the qualities that eventually you're going to bring to the body in and of itself, or feelings or mind states or mental qualities in and of themselves. But to come to those frames of reference with any solidity, you need to have practice with these three qualities in your daily life. So remember to stick by the precepts and watch over your behavior. Be alert to see when you might be breaking a precept. If you feel any temptation to break it, develop the quality of ardency, trying to figure out how not to. Most often the problem is that a good half of the mind wants to break the precept. So even though there are lots of skills that the Buddha recommends for holding to the precepts, learning how to say no to our greed, no to our anger, no to our delusion, we apply those teachings in only a half-hearted way. Then we say that the Buddha's recommendations are not working, so we go and give in to the temptation. But the actual problem is that we haven't given the teachings a fair chance. And the result of this half-heartedness is that we stay half-minded and bewildered. We wonder, is the Buddha really right about skillful behavior? If you try to behave skillfully and all you do is find yourself getting really tense about it, is it really all that skillful? Well, the real question is, why are you getting tense? Is this the mind's way of looking for an excuse not to stick with skillful behavior? There are ways of sticking with the precepts and staying perfectly relaxed around them. After all, the mind is in a state of normalcy when it's not killing, not stealing, not engaging in all these other unskillful forms of behavior. So why are you tense and refraining from these actions? Are you trying to make them unattractive to yourself? It's only when you're really true with yourself that you're going to see the truth, and this is what it comes down to. Ajahn Lee made this point many times, as did Ajahn Fuang. The reason we're uncertain is because we're not looking truly at what we're doing. There are things we hide from ourselves, things we've done that we don't want to admit to ourselves. We've acted on intentions that we don't like to own up to. This is what keeps us bewildered. The only way out of this bewilderment is to finally admit to ourselves that, yeah, we are causing suffering. This is what we keep running up against. There's suffering going on and it's related to our behavior. You want to learn to get past all the mental subterfuges and elaborate excuses you can give to keep on engaging in the behavior that part of you likes, but also knows is not really skillful. When you've decided you've had enough, that's when you're really ready for the practice. So suffering is what causes us to be bewildered, but it's also what reminds us that we want to stop being bewildered. Otherwise, we're just going to keep banging our heads against the wall of that suffering. That's where the other reaction comes in. The search. Maybe there's a way out, maybe there's somebody who knows how to put an end to suffering. The Buddha stands ready to give you his advice. It's simply up to you as to when you're ready to take it. Less is more. July 2, 2009. We spread thoughts of goodwill for all the world, that we don't wish anyone any harm. We wish that all beings could find happiness. So why are we sitting here with our eyes closed? Why aren't we going out there, making people happy? Because happiness is something that has to come from within. It's based on being skillful in the way you act, which includes not only your physical actions, but also your speech and the actions of your mind, and in particular, the act of intention. This is because it's through our intentions that we shape the world we experience, along with the amount of pleasure or pain we take out of that experience. To formulate intentions that really do lead to happiness is a skill. And because it's a skill, nobody else can master the skill for you. You can't master the skill for anyone else. You can give other people advice, you can show them to some extent how to do things, but for them to find happiness requires that they take the issue of happiness seriously, that they learn how to be skillful in their approach to happiness. If you're going to give them reliable advice or set a reliable example, you yourself need to learn how to be skillful, too. So, both for the sake of our own true happiness and for the true happiness of others, this is why we're sitting here meditating. We're training the mind to be very attentive, continually attentive to what it's doing, so that it can learn how to do it skillfully. This means that even though there is the quest for peace, the quest for stillness in the mind, it's not just peace and stillness for its own sake. It's for the sake of understanding what we're doing to cause suffering, and what we can do to stop it. That's the purpose of our understanding. Last week I was teaching up in Canada, and the question came up. Isn't the purpose of all this practice to find the ultimate truth about things? And the answer is no. We're trying to find a particular truth that's useful for a higher purpose, the purpose of true happiness. It's truth with a purpose. After all, there are many truths of the world. We can talk about how lasting things are, and in some ways it's true. We can talk about how ephemeral they are, and in some ways that's true as well. We can talk about the happiness in relationships, and there really is happiness in relationships. But we can also talk about the suffering in relationships, and there's a lot of that too. The question is, what use comes from focusing on which truths? Where do they lead you? Once, when I was first staying with Ajahn Fuang, there was another young monk who had ordained at his fiancée's request. She wanted to make sure her husband had had some training as a monk before they got married. So he spent 2 weeks out there at the monastery and found that he liked the life of a monk a lot more than he had expected. When the night came for his parents and fiancée to pick him up and take him back to Disrab in Bangkok, Ajahn Fuang could sense that he was getting a little reluctant to go. So that night he gave a talk on how we're not born alone. We're born from our parents. We owe a debt to our parents, and we need to repay that debt. A few days later, I was beginning to get concerned about my own debt to my father, and Ajahn Fuang said, when we come to this world, we come alone. Nobody comes with us. Nobody hired us to come. 2 different truths. Both true, and the question is learning how to use those truths properly in the right context. Which means that the uses of these truths are what's important. The ultimate use is finding out how we create a lot of unnecessary stress and suffering for ourselves in spite of ourselves, and how we can put an end to it. That's why we train the mind. To see this clearly, we have to get the mind still. Get the mind with one object, so it can settle down and have a good solid foundation that doesn't shift around all the time. The more you shift around, the less you see. You might think that the more territory you cover, the more sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations you'll see. But you don't see them clearly. And the memory of what you do see is very impermanent. When you try to gather up that kind of wealth, the wealth of memories and experiences, you find that it doesn't stay with you. It's like buying a huge shipload of lettuce, thinking it'll supply you with all the lettuce you need for the rest of your life. And, of course, the lettuce begins to rot pretty fast, and after a while you can't use it. You then have the burden of trying to throw it away. So you need to get a different kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that doesn't change. You find that it doesn't require you to know a lot of things outside, but it does require you to know your mind very thoroughly. How does your mind process things? That's where the stress and suffering come from. The Buddha explains the causes of stress and suffering in a very elaborate sequence. It starts with ignorance and goes through many different factors. But one obvious point to notice is that many of the factors come prior to your sensory experience. In other words, the issue is all about what you bring to the experience. That's what makes all the difference. This is why we train the mind. So that it can bring the right qualities, the right intentions, the right attention paying. Attention to where there's stress, and what can you do to put an end to it, by focusing on what you did to cause it. That kind of knowledge is useful in all circumstances, for it enables you to bring the right attitudes, the right qualities to bear, no matter what the situation. So we start out here with our eyes closed, sitting still, to get the mind to settle down, so that we can see it, so that we can develop some of these skills. But these skills are not just to be used when sitting here with our eyes closed. They're for us to bring to any situation, no matter what, no matter how complex, no matter how large and complicated. If we can bring the right attitudes to those situations, we don't have to suffer. We don't have to cause suffering for other people. They may not like what we say or do, because we can't have any control over people's likes and dislikes, which are pretty unreliable. But we can be firm in our intent not to cause anyone any harm. This is the kind of knowledge and these are the kind of truths we're looking for. The truth of what you're doing right now. What is your intention right now? Is it a skillful intention? And skillful doesn't mean just good, because you can have good intentions for others, but you can also have a lot of delusion at the same time, in which case your intention is not really skillful. When you're looking for skillful intentions, you're looking for intentions that aren't founded on greed, aren't founded on aversion, and aren't founded on delusion. That's what you're working for. That means you have to start with something immediately present and really obvious, like the breath. Just be with the breath as it comes in, be with the breath as it goes out. Part of the mind will complain that there's not much happening, but the more space you give to the breath, the more you see what's there. In other words, you don't want to clutter up your mind with other thoughts. You have to realize in this case that less is more. The fewer things you're thinking about, the more you'll see right here, right now. So whatever other concerns you may have about your situation at home, at work, or the world outside, put those concerns aside for the time being. Be as fully aware of the body, as fully aware of the breath as you can right now. Think of the breath as a whole body process. It's not just the air coming in and out of the lungs. It's the flow of energy throughout the body, part of which is related to the flow of the blood and to the sense of aliveness in your nerves. Try to be sensitive to the whole body as you breathe in and breathe out. Notice if there's any tension or tightness in any part of the body. Allow it to relax. If there's a sense of nourishment and refreshment, allow that to expand. Ask yourself, what would be the most refreshing way to breathe right now? See how the body responds. And stick with it, trying to stay on top of the body's breath needs and providing whatever you sense it needs with each and every breath. Because it's in sticking with the breath that the mind develops some steadiness. Once your gaze is steady, it can begin to see other movements in the mind as they happen. But for the time being, you don't want to pay them any attention. You want to pay attention more to the movements of the breath. If there are any thoughts coming up, you can just let them go, let them go, let them go. Again, less is more. The fewer the thoughts cluttering up your awareness, the more you'll sense how the breath can fill the range of your awareness. The more sensitive you are, the more likely the mind is to settle down, to have a sense of ease and well-being right here, right now. Comb through any tangles of tension in the body, any knots of blockage in the breath. The more demanding you are in not allowing the tension to stay, the more subtleties you'll see. It's like being the princess who couldn't even have a pea under many mattresses. The difference here being that if you sense any little peas under the mattress, you take them out. That's the work at the beginning of the meditation. Ironing things out, smoothing things out, asking questions about the breath. What kind of breathing would feel good now? And what would feel good now? Because sometimes you can breathe in a way that stays steadily the same for long periods of time, and the body feels fine. At other times, one type of breathing might feel good for a couple breaths, and then not so good with the next breath, so you've got to change. The important thing is that you stay with the breath as your main topic, to develop what is called singleness of preoccupation, which means both that you hold to one preoccupation, the breath, and you make it single in the sense that it's the one thing that fills the whole range of your awareness, with breath energy flowing through the body, even around the body. Think of it as a cocoon around the body, protecting you from outside energies. See how long you can maintain that perception. It's an act of balancing. If you've ever noticed people walking across a tightrope, you notice that they don't stay perfectly balanced all the time. They shift a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, and then they correct, like those old-fashioned scales that swing back and forth before finally coming into balance. If something tips it in one direction, the scale corrects itself, swinging back and forth until it's in balance again. The ability to regain your balance is what's going to keep you here. Our mind is often like the mind of an addict, the sort of person who says, "I've been smoking pot for the last 5 years, but now I'm totally clean, totally beyond that. I'll never be tempted to smoke again." That kind of attitude is going to get him back into smoking pot pretty soon. The way to stay away from your addiction is to realize that there are certain things that attract you, so you have to be on your guard, armed with antidotes for every temptation. You need to have antidotes to bring yourself back into balance. So realize that there's always a possibility of falling out of balance, but you can master the skills that can get you back in. That's what the directed thought and evaluation at the beginning of right concentration are all about. If you find the mind slipping off the breath, you can get it back right away. If it slips off in another direction, you get it back right away. You keep regaining your balance no matter how much it wobbles. After a while, things finally settle down. You get more and more absorbed in the breath. There's a greater sense of oneness. A greater sense of concentration, composure, assurance that this is where you really want to be, and it's all right where it is. Right now. At that point, you don't have to adjust or analyze the breath anymore. Just stay with full body breath, whole body breath, aware. It's as if the awareness in the body and the breath penetrate one another. There's a strong sense of oneness. It's from this oneness that we can begin to see things clearly. The important thing right now is just to make sure that your foundation is strong and that you do whatever is needed to maintain and regain that sense of balance. You may find the mind going into its old habits of trying to gather up this, gather up that, so remember, less is more. Just the breath. Just the breath. You don't need anything else. If you give a lot of attention to the breath, you begin to see its potentials and can take advantage of them. You find that a sense of ease and well-being with the breath can do a lot more for you than any amount of status, material gain, praise, outside pleasures, any of the ways of the world. A sense of ease and well-being that come from within. This is really all you need because it fully nourishes the mind right now. A well-nourished mind gives rise to more mindfulness and ultimately to the knowledge that can put an end to defilement, which is an even greater example of the case that less is more. The fewer your defilements, the more freedom you have. As the Buddha said, when he gained awakening, he dwelled with an unrestricted awareness, free from any attachments, free from any constriction. It's the greatest wealth there is. Rehab work. January 16, 2011. Take a couple of good long, deep in and out breaths and see how that feels. If it feels good, keep it up. If it feels too strenuous, try another rhythm of breathing. Shorter, more shallow, heavier, or lighter. Just pose this question in the mind. What kind of breathing would feel good now? You'll notice that the breathing process is not just air coming in and out of the nose. The body has to move. The movement of the body is what we're interested in. That's also a kind of breath. It's the energy that allows the air to come in and out. Notice where you feel that energy. Where it feels good, where it doesn't feel so good. If it doesn't feel good, you can change it. Just keep asking that question, what would feel good right now? Each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out, try to get a sense of exactly how long a breath feels just right. You want to stay with the breathing process as consistently as you can, so that you can notice the little signals that tell you things like, now the breath is getting too long, or it wasn't deep enough just now, so let's try a little bit deeper this time. Only when you watch continually like this can you actually notice these things. If your attention skips off someplace else, you miss a lot of the signals. You're trying to stay with the breath, but don't stay just through force of will. Try to stay with a sense of curiosity. You're exploring and learning new habits. You may discover that the way you've been breathing has not been good for the body. Some parts of the body seem to be starved of breath energy, other parts are overworked. If you find a part of the body that's been overworked, let it relax and think of each breath coming in directly to that part to give it more energy. You may have to adjust your posture a bit so that the body is more balanced, not leaning to the left, not leaning to the right, not stooped over, not tilting back. Try to sensitize yourself to what the body is doing in the process of breathing and to what you can do to make it a more healing process. After all, the breath is what keeps the body alive. If the breathing goes really well, it'll do more than just keep the body alive. It can actually be healing for the body. The Buddha often compares his Dhamma to medicine. He's a doctor. The medicine is not a chemical compound. It's more like a rehab process. You're rehabilitating your body. You're rehabilitating your mind because the mind has its diseases, too, you know. The diseases of greed, aversion, and delusion. We wound ourselves with things we do under the influence of these unskillful mental qualities. Although we may have picked up habits from the outside, in the same way that we can pick up germs from the outside, the act of choosing to follow the habits that others have modeled for us was our choice. Our resistance was down. So the diseases we have in the mind are self-inflicted. To heal the mind, you don't just let it sit there and do nothing, or be non-reactive. Again, think of this as rehab work. If you sprain your ankle, you can't just sit there and leave it immobile. That'll make it worse. You've got to find exercises to keep it mobile and to keep it from freezing into unhealthy positions. This is why, when the Buddha teaches meditation, he doesn't say simply to be non-reactive. He does want you to learn patience, so you can sit with things for a while and watch them, but not just to leave it at that. You watch things carefully and patiently so that you can see when you have any unhealthy habits, any unhealthy ways of thinking, unhealthy ways of perceiving things. By noticing them, you can change them. That's why he gives you suggestions for different ways of looking at things and different ways of exercising the mind. He had a conversation one time with some monks, telling them it would be good if they practiced more breath meditation. One monk said, "I already practice breath meditation." The Buddha asked, "What kind of breath meditation do you practice?" The monk replied, "I put aside thoughts of the past. I don't hanker after the future. I'm just very equanimous about what happens in the present moment as I breathe in, as I breathe out." The Buddha responded, "Well, there is that kind of breath meditation, but that's not the kind that gives the best results." Then, he taught the monks the 16 steps of breath meditation. If you look at those 16 steps, you notice a lot of them involve training you to breathe in a certain way, to pay attention to, emphasize, and give rise to certain feelings, to give rise to certain mental states, and to give rise to mental qualities that are healing. For instance, once you get in touch with how the breath feels, try to be aware of the whole body, so that you can notice the impact of the breath on the body. If you notice that it's too strenuous in some spots, or you're putting too much force on some spots, try to calm it down. You try to breathe in a way that gives rise to a sense of fullness and ease. You begin to notice how the feelings created by focusing on the breath have an impact on the mind. You also notice how the perceptions of what's happening in the breathing process have an impact both on the mind and on the way you breathe. You try to calm all of that down. Then you look at the state of your mind. Is it steady enough? How is its energy level? If its energy level is low, try to gladden it. If it's too frenetic, try to steady it. If you notice that the mind is thinking about or focusing on things in a way that's burdensome, try to free it from those burdens. In other words, you're doing rehab work. You're exercising the mind through playing with the process of breathing. You're getting to know the process of breathing really thoroughly, and through that you're getting to see how the process of fabrication shapes your present experience. In the Buddha's analysis of causation, he talks about how ignorance has an impact on the process of fabrication, and the 3 types of fabrication, bodily, verbal, and mental, then have an impact on how we receive input through the senses. One of the ways we fabricate our experience is through the way we breathe. That's called bodily fabrication. When we breathe with ignorance, it leads to suffering and to stress. But if we breathe with full awareness and alertness, it can alleviate that stress. So, what we're doing now is bringing more knowledge and awareness to the process of breath fabrication. By exercising all the possibilities of how you could think about and perceive the breath, you can discover what's most healing for you. This way we're also exercising the mind by exploring the process of breath fabrication together with mental fabrication. How we fabricate feelings and perceptions, and how those feelings and perceptions shape the state of the mind. We're taking a proactive stance. Sometimes this means just watching for a while and not doing anything so that you can see things more clearly. But once you see things clearly, then when you see you're doing something uncomfortable or harmful, you can change your habits. As you develop sensitivity from this exploration, it can then be applied to other habits and ways of thinking and acting that are harmful either to yourself or to others as well. You're continuing to do rehab work on your own mind, learning how to think and act in new ways. There was a group of ascetics during the Buddha's time, called the Jains. They reasoned that people suffer because of their actions. Therefore, people should just stop acting. By learning how to stop acting, being totally non-reactive, that would be the way to release. The Buddha pointed out that it's not healing for the mind to simply stop acting. It doesn't release or free the mind. It just freezes things. His path is more proactive by teaching you to examine your actions in the present and, wherever they're causing harm, to learn to act in a new way, a way that ultimately does lead to the end of action. This new way of acting also leads to the end of intention, but it does this through understanding and through the mastery of skills. How to breathe, how to perceive things, and how to think about things. These are the skills with which you heal yourself. As you look back on your life, you're bound to see lots of times when you acted in ways that were hurtful to yourself and to others. What you're trying to create now as you meditate is a place where you can do healing work. Do healing actions, think healing thoughts, think healing perceptions. You start by training your thoughts or perceptions and learning how to breathe in a healing way. This is rehab work for the mind, it's rehab work for the way you approach experience in general. So the Buddha wasn't the kind of doctor who would have you lie in bed and remain immobile. He also wasn't the kind of doctor who would just give you a shot and send you home. He was more like a physical therapist teaching you new ways to walk, new ways to hold your body as you sit. Further than that, of course, he teaches you new ways to breathe, new ways to think, new ways to perceive things. As you develop these new habits, you find that the habits themselves are healing. So think of the breath work, the meditation, as rehab work. Effort is involved. You have to learn how to think in new ways, how to ask questions, and how to look with new eyes at what's going on. You have to notice how you're shaping your experience, and then try out new, more healing ways of shaping that experience. As you develop these new skills, you find that they take you to true health. That's one of the Buddha's names for Nibbana. True health for the mind, a mind that's been healed, because it knows how to do its own healing work. Kindfulness. May 1, 2010. As you train the mind, focusing on the breath, allowing the breath to be comfortable, trying to become friends with the breath, it's a very direct way of showing goodwill to yourself and to the people around you. Goodwill for yourself in the sense that you learn how to develop a source of happiness that comes from within. Your happiness is less dependent on outside conditions. And this is why it's an act of goodwill for others, in that this happiness doesn't have to take anything away from anyone else. Now in the beginning, as you're learning the ropes, it's very helpful to have conducive outside conditions. As with any skill, you want to learn the basics with as few distractions as possible, along with a supportive environment and helpful people to inspire you, to encourage you, to give you advice. So in the beginning, this happiness is very much dependent on conditions. But as you get more and more skilled, you find that you can carry this sense of being well-centered, having an awareness that fills the body, that feels at ease with the body, feels at ease with the breath into all kinds of situations. Where in the past you felt threatened, nervous, or ill at ease, now you have a solid center. You're grounded and you're taking care of the mind's need to feed. It's something we don't often think about, but it's an important question to ask yourself. Where is your mind feeding? What kinds of things is it looking for to give itself strength, to give itself pleasure, to give itself nourishment? All too often, you find you're feeding on the words and actions of other people, things around you. Inside, you find yourself feeding on greed, feeding on anger, feeding on delusion. None of these things are good healthy food. But as you feed on the comfortable breath, it's not just the breath you're feeding on. You're also feeding on the good qualities you're developing in the mind as you stick with the breath. Conviction, persistence, mindfulness, alertness, concentration, discernment, goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. These are all good qualities to develop. As for the word qualities here, it's best to think of them as habits you develop in the mind. That's because it's more useful to think of the mind in terms of what it's doing than in terms of what it is. In other words, if you think of your mind as a thing with particular characteristics, a narrow mind, a broad mind, a good mind, a bad mind, you find yourself stuck inside that particular characterization and it's hard to get out. But if you see it simply as a bundle of different activities, then an activity is something you can change. Just because you did something yesterday doesn't mean you have to do it again today. As you give the mind a better and better place to stay, a better place on which to base its activities, more solid, more reliable, more pleasurable, it's more likely to do the skillful thing, because it's not so tempted to go out and get a quick fix, a quick bite to eat. That way you can trust your mind more and more. This is probably the scariest thing in life. When you come across different situations where you sense that you can't trust yourself to do the skillful thing, where you're tempted to do something that's either harmful to yourself or harmful to others. But that's the way the mind is if it's dependent on conditions being a certain way. It behaves itself when things go well but not when they don't. The Buddha once said he didn't trust the monks who behaved well, only when there was good food, good clothing, good shelter, and good medicine available. As he said, he couldn't trust that they were really there for the practice. What would they do when the food wasn't so good or if there was a lack in the clothing, shelter, or medicine? This is one of the ways in which the meditation is a gift to yourself. You learn that you can trust yourself more because you're more nourished and at ease in the present moment. You're more at ease with a greater sense of confidence, stability, and strength. And this is a well-being that has no drawbacks. Especially as you develop the mind further and further, you ultimately run across something that's not conditioned at all, not even by inside conditions. That's what the practice is aimed at. A dimension totally free from suffering, totally free from conditions, pure, unadulterated, trustworthy happiness. That's quite a gift. On top of that, you're not the only one who benefits. That's the other side of the practice. You're showing goodwill for others. All aspects of the practice share in this quality of being good for both sides. You start with generosity, which obviously benefits other people, but you benefit as well. The mind grows larger, more expansive, more able to include other people in your consideration. The same with the precepts. You refrain from harming other people. That means you have less remorse to deal with inside. If you're going around intentionally hurting this or that person, and then you sit down and try to make the mind quiet, these things just pop up in your awareness. When they pop up, you can do one of two things. On the one hand, you can deny that they happened or that they were wrong or that that person was worth anything, all of which makes your mind more and more narrow and rigid. Or, on the other hand, you can just sit there overcome with remorse, which is like sticking a knife in an open wound. But if you make a practice of going through the day resolving not to harm other people regardless, then when you feel tempted to say something that's hurtful or untrue, you just hold your tongue. That, of all the precepts, the one against lying is probably the most important and the most relevant all the time. There are not that many situations when we're tempted to kill or steal. Illicit sex, maybe, alcohol and drugs, maybe. But controlling your mouth? That's 24/7, except when you're asleep. As you exercise more restraint over your mouth, you're showing more respect for yourself. As Ajahn Lee once said, you should bow down to your mouth every day. You went to all the trouble of developing the perfections that allow you to be born as a human being. You have a human mouth. It's not like the mouths of animals, which can say only a few things. You can say all kinds of things, so you want to use that mouth well. Think of all the effort that went into gaining it. So when you've been observing the precepts, sticking with them as a promise you make to yourself, then as you sit down and meditate, there's less remorse. Instead, you have a sense that you're living in the world in a harmless way, with a light footprint, and you find it easier to live with yourself. In this way, other people benefit, and you benefit as well. Even more with the meditation. We're working to overcome greed, anger, and delusion in the mind. We're learning to make ourselves more self-reliant, which means that other people will be less subject to our greed, anger, and delusion, and we'll have to lean on them less. As we develop mindfulness, concentration, discernment, compassion, these things can't help but spill over into the way we deal with other people. The Buddha once told the story of two acrobats. The master acrobat got up on the end of a bamboo pole. Apparently they would stick these poles up vertically. He got up on top of the pole, had his assistant get up on his shoulders, and then told her, "Now, you look out after me, and I'll look out after you as we do our tricks on the bamboo pole, and that way we'll come down safely." And she said, "No, that won't work. I have to look out after myself and you look after yourself, and that way we'll help each other keep our balance on the pole." In other words, by keeping your balance you're helping other people keep their balance. And the Buddha said that in that particular case the assistant was the one who was right. But there are other cases where, when looking out after other people, you're looking out after yourself. As you develop kindness and care in how you treat other people, you're benefiting yourself. As you develop goodwill, patience, and harmlessness in the way you treat them, you're benefiting yourself. As you develop good qualities in the mind, as you meditate persistence, dedication, mindfulness, you're benefiting other people as well. So this is why this is a special practice. You're developing a happiness that spreads around. At the same time, this sense of well-being in the mind is what allows you to look at your actions in all fairness and see where they're skillful and where they're not. When the mind is feeling tired and hungry and weak, it doesn't like to look at its mistakes, and as a result it's not going to learn from them. You're not going to learn from anything you won't look at. But when you can develop this greater sense of well-being inside, you can reflect with more fairness and greater sensitivity on the areas where your actions either harmed yourself or harmed other people. This simple principle of looking at things in terms of actions and results goes very deep in the practice. As I said earlier, when you think about the mind, don't think about it as a thing or entity. Think of it as just lots and lots of actions. Look at the ways you think, the ways you focus on things, the ways you understand things, the ways you interpret things, the intentions you have, the ways you pay attention to things. These are all actions that might be skillful or not. As your sensitivity develops, you begin to see more and more where you're acting in an unskillful way, thinking, interpreting, or intending in unskillful ways. Because you're now coming from this settled place, you can begin to think more and more about how you can do things more skillfully. Keep doing this, and your sense of skillful will grow more and more refined. Try to develop a sense of yourself as someone who's always willing to learn, especially from your mistakes. You don't beat yourself up over your mistakes. You try not to make mistakes so that you don't have the extra burden of looking back on blameworthy mistakes, i.e., ones where you knew better but went ahead with harmful behavior anyhow. But when you do make a mistake, you say, "Okay, that was a mistake. What can I learn from it?" You realize that beating yourself up extra hard is not going to compensate for something you did, and it's certainly not going to put you in a better position to do it skillfully the next time. The more you look at the events in the mind in this way, the more you see that what you thought were things or entities or inherent natures you couldn't change are actually actions. Even your sense of self is a type of action. You identify with ideas, you identify with the body, you identify with your possessions, your relationships, your role outside in the world, and in each case that identification is a kind of mental activity. Because it's an activity, then the question becomes not, which self is the true me? The question becomes, when is the activity of having a sense of self skillful, and when is it not? You see that among the various selves you create, the ones that are more responsible, that are more careful, more willing to learn, those are the ones you want to nurture. In particular, the sense of self that's confident that it can do the practice. The Buddha strongly encourages you to foster that sense of self. The sense of self that wants true happiness. He says to honor that sense of self. Don't be a traitor to it. Heedfulness, restraint. These are all activities of wise selfing. They're things you want to develop. As for the senses of self that say, I just want my quick fix, I want my quick bite right now, those are selves you have to look askance at. Those are the ones you don't feed. This is where the teaching on not self comes in. You begin to realize that just because something comes up in the mind doesn't mean you have to identify with it. After all, there's a lot of activity in the mind that comes simply from the force of past karma, your past actions. And that's not your karma right now. Your karma right now is what you do with those things. You have the choice to go with them or not. Try to make the most of that choice, because as you exercise that freedom, you find more and more what freedom means in the mind. This goes deep into the meditation. You have to keep this in mind all the way to the most refined levels, because when the mind gets very still, very centered, very spacious, there's a strong sense of oneness, a strong sense that you've arrived at the ground of being, an awareness that doesn't seem to be touched by anything. It's very easy to mistake that for some sort of metaphysical principle, with the sense that this is the way things are. Being with a capital B. But even there, the Buddha has you recognize it as a kind of activity. It's actually a doing. As he once said, the highest state of oneness or non-duality is a sense of the non-duality of consciousness, a sense of knowing that permeates everything. It's a skillful state, but it's not what we're here for because it's not the end of suffering. You have to learn to question it in terms of activities. What were the activities that brought you there? What did you do, knowingly or unknowingly, intentionally or not, that gave rise to that? What are you doing to keep it going? Even though it's subtle, there has to be an activity to keep it going. Even just the perception, the label there. That's an activity. To what extent is that activity still stressful? Can you drop whatever's causing that stress? These are the questions the Buddha has you ask, looking at everything as actions, actions you want to do skillfully, actions you want to do or stop doing for the sake of putting an end to suffering. In other words, this line of questioning is motivated by goodwill, motivated by compassion for yourself and for other people, always realizing that the more skillful you become in training the mind, learning how to act with more precision, more skill, more finesse, then the less you suffer and the less the people around you suffer. You have more positive things to share. As the Buddha once said, there are only two things he taught: suffering or stress, and the end of suffering or stress. To get to the end involves understanding the principle of action. What you're doing, where it's skillful, where it's not, what you can learn from where it's skillful and where it's not. That way, you can ultimately reach the dimension where suffering ends, or as the Buddha says, you see it with the body or touch it with the body. In other words, it's a totally full experience. It's not just something in your head where your happiness doesn't have to depend on any conditions at all. That's when you can trust yourself. You don't need to feed on anything outside anymore. You've got something so solid that it doesn't need to be nourished. And it doesn't depend on conditions, it doesn't depend on space and time. So it causes no harm to anybody at all. As with all aspects of the practice, it's a gift to yourself and to others. Once you've experienced this, you can speak with more confidence about what really works, how the mind can be trained, what's skillful in training the mind, what's not skillful in training the mind. You can trust yourself, and other people can trust you more as well. So this practice is not only a gift, it's also something good to give yourself too. Because it gives so much back. You look at the world and there are so many things that clamor for your time and attention. But if you ask yourself, if I gave myself to that, what would I be left with? And you realize, not much. But this is one training, one practice that more than lives up to its promise. So give it a serious try. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.